Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser. And for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. I'm pleased to welcome in Chris Spikey Goldbach. You may know Spikey because he's been in a whole bunch of bands. He's been involved in the music scene in Florida for many, many, many years. But Spikey's here to tell a story. Hey, Spikey, welcome into the podcast. Great to have you.
Hey, Jeff, good to be here, man. As we were talking about in the intro, it's like I'm really excited to be here because we need somebody to document not only South Florida scene, but all of Florida, And it's great that you're doing it because I don't know if anybody else is at this point, to the caliber that you're doing it, right?
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey, great.
It's great to have you here because I know that your story, like so many others, is so important. And I'm so glad that this is the moment where those checking this episode out will finally get to know you on an even deeper level because I am certain that there's a lot to uncover today.
Yeah, and I've always been the one to fly under the radar, right? I've never really done a lot of interviews but I think it's important that my story gets out there and just my past
Well, let's do it. We're going to time travel and go back to the earliest beginnings. So thinking about your origin story, Spikey, where did you grow up?
So I was born in upstate New York in Schenectady. And in 1971, 74, my dad landed a job as an insurance salesman down in Broward County. There was an opening. So we moved to Tamarac in 74. I was 3 years old. I have a brother who's 10 years older than me and also a musician. He's a ripping guitar player, right? So I kind of always had the music in my household, He was a guitar player playing in bands. My parents, there was always music going on. Growing up in South Florida, we had a swimming pool. Every night my mom and my dad would swim. I would be like the DJ. I would like flip the records for them. So my mom had like Elton John, ABBA, John Lennon, right? My dad was born in 1930 in Germany. So he was 15 years old when the war ended, right? So he came over and his influences were like Roger Whittaker, Kenny Rogers, and then German marches, and they would play that. He wired speakers out in the back patio, So I was like a sponge at a young age. Like I'm talking like 5, 6, 7 years old, like soaking in all these different styles of music. So
as you were growing up, getting into your teens and then into your early 20s, talk to me about some of your early memories of high school. Where'd you go to school? And also, what was the vibe there? Were there any kids that you were friends with or you were aware of that were also in any bands at that time?
Well, this dates way before high school. This dates when I was 10 years old. When I was 10 years old, I got my first drum kit. It was like a shitty department store drum kit, from a department store in Chicago called Alden's, right? And, back in the day, you would get the pre-internet, you would get the Christmas wish books and the Christmas catalogs. And I found this drum kit in there and I kind of circled it. I would leave hints for my mom, like put it on the kitchen, so when she woke up, she'd see it. So I got that drum kit when I was 10. Back then, a lot of my neighbors, which we'll get to in a bit, were also getting into music too. So there was a school in Fort Lauderdale, like North Fort Lauderdale, called ASM, School of Music, right? So they would go door to door and recruit kids. I don't know how they got these addresses, but a lot of my neighbors actually went to that school. I didn't officially go to the school. I would go with them like Friday or Saturday nights, and I would hang out in the plaza while they were taking lessons, and I would go to a convenience store and get a Yoo-Hoo or something like that, And then the parents would pick us up and I'd go back home. So at that young age, the 10, 11-year-old age, that's when me and my friends started actually playing music together. We started a band. It was a ripoff of Musical Youth. It was we called ourselves Junior League. I sent you a couple photos of the T-shirt, right? Like we each got the instrument we played. We went to the Coral Springs Mall. They had like a shop where you can get iron-ons. So, I had a drum set, and on the back it said Junior League, and we would just play on the patios and my parents' living room, and just mess around. I don't even think we had any legit songs together. We would just jam, you know. So that's how my musical journey actually started, and and then getting into high school, and then so we started a band called that was musically, or I'm sorry, Junior League. Um, a year or two after that, myself, my buddy Brian Tatunic, who lived kind of catty corner from me, and my brother, we played the Battle of the Bands at the Coral Springs Skating Center, roller skating center off University, and we did Van Halen, Jump, or I'm sorry, Panama. Panama, we did Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It, and we did an original. We didn't end up winning because we were probably pretty bad. I'm sure my brother shredded, but so, and then I just remember I was probably like in seventh grade at that time, so I just remember going back to school that Monday thinking I was like, hot shit, like I just played the Battle of the Bands, this little kid, you know. Back then, like in the early 80s, like the music scene was really vibrant. I remember they would have like concerts at like the Tamarac Park, where they'd set up a stage, bands would come and bands would rock out and we'd go there and it was great. And the Coral Springs Skating Center had the Battle of the Bands, and so after that, I got into high school. I went to Taravella, because I grew up in Tamarac, and they bust the Tamarac kids into Coral Springs, which in the early days, the Coral Springs people didn't like that. They're like, oh, these scumbags coming to our school, So, but from there, Brian Tatunic, he introduced me to this guy, Pete Gross, which was like total punk rock dude, right? And let me go back for a little bit, because my first 3 records albums that I got, my brother bought me, I think probably on my 10th or 11th birthday, and it was the Ramones, End of the Century, it was Devo, Freedom of Choice, and it was AC/DC, Dirty Deeds. So you can tell right there between those 3 bands, it's like all over the map, and that's why my musical influence has always been just like this. Like I love everything. So anyway, I got introduced to this guy, Pete Gross, punk rock dude, mohawk, crash shirt, like combat boots. I'm like, oh, this dude's pretty cool, And then we started a band. It was Brian, myself, Pete, and then we had another dude, Mikey, from Taravella, and we called ourselves Distant Anger. And we went and actually recorded. And keep in mind, I was 13. How old are you when you go into high school? 13, 14, I think, when depending on when you're born. So my brother's buddy had a studio in Margate. We went and tracked like 4 or 5 songs there. And yeah, we would play a couple parties. We didn't really play many shows, So that's how that started. And then Brian kind of started leaning off more towards like the industrial kind of stuff, and me and Pete went the other way. Now, keep in mind, when I met Pete, I was introduced to like just, again, like Crass, Circle Jerks, Suicidal Tendencies, the Meat Men, just all the stuff that I never heard when I was younger, And now I'm hearing that, and I'm enticed by that. I'm like, I love the aggressiveness and just the anger, and so we kind of went our way. Brian went his way, and then we started another band called Blatant View with a couple of Fort Lauderdale dudes.
Was it in that same style of music, or was it something a little different?
This was a little heavier than Distant Anger. Distant Anger was kind of like, I would sing backup tracks, backup vocals to that, and my voice sounded like a 5-year-old kid, super high, and So when Blatant View started, it was like a little heavier, because it was just like the more like punk kind of sound, right? Angry and just yeah.
Did you feel that way as a kid at that time, or was it just that?
Not really. I mean, I wasn't an angry kid, to be honest with you. I mean, I grew up middle class, and I always had a roof over my head. I always had food on the table. So I can't. A lot of my and my parents to this day are still married, right? So I never. But a lot of my friends came from broken homes, and so I would see that, But I wasn't really like an angry kid. I was just like some skateboard punk that loved to play music. I just like jamming.
And as you were starting to explore new types of bands and music, talk about your concert experiences. Who were some of the bands you may have been seeing, both large and small, and what some of those venues were?
Well, First and foremost, I mean, I would have to say the Cameo Theater. I was telling you earlier, I'm like the middle school guy. I wasn't like the old school because that was the generation before me. They had like Flynn's and some other venues down there. So my first show was actually Black Flag. I think it was late '85, maybe early '86. It was at the Cameo. It was Black Flag, Painted Willie, and Gone. And a lot of my friends, even Danny from AAA, I think that was his first show. I didn't know him back then, but so we had the Cameo Theater, which literally was like Mecca for me. It was like my church. I would see so many. I was fortunate to see so many bands back in the day. We had the Cell in Hollywood, Florida, which is talked a lot about on here. Locally, more around Coral Springs, we had this like venue like Club Soda, which was like by the Banana Boat in Coral Springs off Sample there. I think Sample in Rock Island. Yeah, so those are some of the venues. But I think to me, the Cameo Theater was like, I would lie to my parents. Hey, I'm going to, I wouldn't lie because technically I would go sleep over at Pete Gross's house. I would skate. He lived a couple blocks from me, so I would skate over there. We'd all pile in he had this old Chevy Nova. There'd be like 10 of us who pile in there. The standard routine was go to the old Coral Springs Mall, pick up probably like 5, 6 other dudes or girls too, and just drive down there. We would get there early because back then Miami Beach was like desolate. It was like abandoned hotels, homeless people, and like retirees, right? So that was like our playground. We would skateboard. A lot of the old abandoned hotels actually had pools with semi-decent transitions where you can actually drain them and somewhat skate it. So we'd be there all day. We'd go to the shows and come back and do it the next week. It seems like I was there every weekend for years.
Wow. Who were some of the other bands that you were going to see at that time, whether it be the Cameo or Club Soda or any of the other places that you may have been checking things out?
So WLRN had a radio show run by Bob Slade. It was Off the Beaten Path, and obviously that was talked on here a lot. And that's how I actually got introduced to a lot of new music and a lot of free tickets because he would like 10th caller gets a free ticket to the show. And for some reason, I would always be that fucking caller. I would always get free tickets and I'd get in. He actually finally had to cut me off. He's like, all right, Chris Goldbach, you're cut off. I can't, but to answer your question, like I said, my first show was Black Flag, but it was just everybody back in the day, like Bad Brains, Gangrene, the Meatmen, Circus Jerks, Descendants, you name it, like the 80s punk bands. They would, the funny thing, they would come down to Florida and then they would hang out all day on the beach and they would be they'd look like a tomato because they'd be all sunburned, hanging out on the beach and stuff like that. So, but yeah, local bands back then, I mean, we had like Disorderly Conduct, we had Rugged Edge, we had F, we had Amazing Grace, the Drills. Now, Amazing Grace. So the weird thing about the scene back then, a few of these bands were more rock influenced. They not really punk, but like more like rock kind of. But they were accepted. Like Amazing Grace and the Drills were kind of more like long hair and stuff like that. But they were good. People really liked them, so they got a lot of the Cameo shows. So going there and to this venue, and again, the Cameo was like it was kind of a dump. It was great, but there was not much to it. It was a big open room with some seats and a stage and Art Deco. The walls were pink and it had the green Art Deco stripes in the wall. And this was a point in time where there would be 1,500 kids there, right? So it wasn't a small event by any means. It was like a big thing, and it was just like being exposed to that. I don't even know if I was intimidated at first, because I was just like, because I knew a lot of people, right? So it's like I kind of knew a lot of people going there, and you had your Dade people, your Broward people, your Palm Beach people, right? So the crowd definitely intrigued me. It was just like punk rock kids, and my parents rather, and to this day, super conservative, right? So there would be times where like I'd have a Bad Religion album or something. And oh, what is that? So, but yeah, so the crowds were great. It's just, I loved it. I basically felt at home, when I got there.
Were there any types of events going on too at this time where there was several bands playing? Anything like that ever occur during your early formidable period too?
Yeah, there were a few shows at the Cameo that we would play. Like they would have like a skate jam, or this was a little bit further on. Probably like in when I was, I guess, 10th, 11th grade, I got into nuclear beer because Pete Gross with Blatant View, he actually went away to college, but he was playing bass at the time with nuclear beer. So when he left, they knew I kind of played guitar and bass as well. So I joined them. And again, this is probably 10th, 11th grade. And but there would be showcases at the Cameo, like like I said, the Skate Fest, and it would be like a bunch of nuclear beer, chocolate grasshoppers, foie, and then I think we even played with Blast, and you know, we had a show. This is predating that at the Tamarac Rec Hall, which Pete Gross brought down somehow. It was the band BGK. They were like a punk band from Holland. They were on Alternative Tentacles, right? So that show, it was like Sacrosanct. I don't know if you're familiar with the Underground Records in Fort Lauderdale. Some dude, Mark. It was more of like a metal band,
Yeah.
So Mark ran Underground Records, and that was like Broward's Open Books and Records, right? That was like Broward's like punk metal record shop to go to. So his band Sacrosanct played, Blatant View played, Nuclear Beer played, and then BGK played from Holland. So that was legit in Tamarac in my backyard. It was great. And we actually walked to the show. Me and Pete walked to the show and walked home.
And when you got connected with the guys from Nuclear Beer, how did that come about?
Well, like I said, Pete went away to college, so I took over his position in bass, and we play a lot of shows. That's my first time actually getting out of town. We'd go up to Gainesville and play with Bad Rep. Bad Rep was like the Broward like skinhead band, And then we did like the Blast show. We did the Suicidal show at the Cameo. And then shortly after, probably a year after I joined, our drummer actually died in a motorcycle wreck. So tragically, I moved to drums. Then we got another bass player to fill in, and that lasted probably to my late junior year. And then John Kennedy, our singer, I think he moved away to Virginia for a little bit, and so that kind of fizzled out. And then I hooked up with another dude, Scott Norman, and Rich Thurston, Scott was probably a year or two younger than me. Rich Thurston, he was in Culture. I don't know if you've had him on the show or not, but probably one you should get because he was, South Florida guy. So we started a band called Mindless Violence. I don't think we played many shows. We played a couple parties, but we didn't really do many shows. We practiced. Rich actually lived across from Taravella, so after school we'd go to his place and jam and write songs and stuff like that. So yeah, that was it. That probably lasted a year or two, and then my senior year, me and Scott kind of kept jamming together, and then we met Lester Norris, which I think he might have been your first guest of the show. I'm not sure.
He was.
Yeah. So we met him, and then my neighbor who kind of lived behind me, which I never knew he played bass, Paco, Pabon. We got together and formed. That was the early stages of Radio Baghdad in 1988. So we had a couple names before Radio Baghdad, like Face Value, but there was a hardcore band in Ohio called Face Value, so we changed it to Twig for some odd reason, a weird name. Then we settled on Radio Baghdad.
What do you remember about some of the earliest Radio Baghdad shows that you played?
The earlier ones were parties. Like we would play like New Year's Eve parties in Tamarac. So we would all just walk to the house. We had a buddy, Dave Stanley, where his mom would she wouldn't be there, so we would just have he had a band called Assault. It was like more of a metal band, and Sammy, come on. Back then it was like metal bands and punk bands, especially at that point, probably like 87, 88, it was like the whole crossover thing was moving in. So we're like, who gives a fuck? It's just like, let's jam and let's have a show. And, but I got to tell you, at first at the Cameo, when that started happening, it wasn't a good scene. A lot of these, when the whole, I guess it would be like the Anthrax or the DRI crossover record. And a lot of these like metalhead guys would come to the Cameo, and the skinheads didn't like it at first. It was like, who the fuck are these guys, infiltrating our scene. But after a while, it was all good. It's like, why not? We all love the music, and so Baghdad started about that point, and in the early stage, we just did like parties and stuff like that.
Did the band's sound evolve from the very early beginnings to some of the
Yes,
later years?
of course. I mean, I remember the first cover we did was "Beat Me Senseless" by the Circle Jerks. Lester was a huge Circle Jerks fan. I mean, we all love the Circle Jerks, you know. But we would do that. We would practice in his parents' house in Heathgate, which in Tamarac, like we have, you know, I lived in Sunflower. Heathgate was like another community across the lake, you know, with these like manufactured kind of homes. So we would all cram in his bedroom must have been like 8x8 or 10x10 or something. So I'd have my drum kit set up and amps and everything. And his dad would come home from work and like bang on the door, hey, turn it down, you're too loud. And it always reminded me of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the DRI song Madman, but that's like Kurt and his brother dad would like also, it's actually recorded on the album where they, you know, you're too damn loud, turn it down, you know, what's wrong with you? So that's how that was like, you know. But yeah, obviously, like with any band, you evolve in your style. I can't remember our super early original stuff. You know, we probably started out just doing covers, and we met Chris Hawkins. You know, so I'm trying to think if there's anything between that era and then when we met Chris Hawkins. So we met Chris Hawkins, and I think Chris Hawkins was like in 8th grade. I don't even think he was in high school, you know, or maybe just started high school. He played Les Paul, you know, and just shredder. So we got him in the band, and I'm trying to think. Scott ended up leaving, so we were kind of more of as a 4-piece. And our bass player Paco kind of left, and then Hawkins had a buddy named Pete Gordon, right? So we got him as bass player, and that's really the core of the band where we started like developing our sound, you know.
How did you get along with Pete Gordon when he joined?
Oh, it was great, dude. Pete Gordon's, we call him El Gordo, you know. He was a great bass player. You know, again, he was probably Hawkins' age. So, like, me and Lester were a little, you know, 3-4 years older than these guys, you know. But they were, like, fast learners. They're great musicians, cool people to hang out with, you know. So yeah, that's pretty much the core of the band. That's how that started.
Once you guys started to play out at clubs, venues, that type situation, what were some of those ones that you started to get booked at? And do you remember who was behind getting you guys on some of those shows?
Yeah, we also started doing a lot of parties. Back in the day, Mullins Park, actually, in Coral Springs, would have shows too. Like 10 years prior to that, how Tamarac Park would have shows. You know, they would set up a stage, they would have bands play. Back in the early days when RadioBaghdad started really officially playing shows, South Florida had a booking agent. It was called, I think, Long Distance Entertainment, and it was like, really, if you wanted to play like the Button South, or you know, you had to be booked by them, right? And they would charge a fee. They would charge probably your 10-15% fee. And we had a lady on our, you know, her name was Ruth, I believe her name was Ruth, and she would book us shows like, you know, it would be the Button South. Washington Square was, you know, because Washington Square, then after Miami Beach started building up, you know, we had Washington Square, where now you couldn't find parking. It was a pain in the ass to get down there.
Was this the first time you were going to these places?
Well, I mean, I've been down to Miami Beach since like the, you know, 84, 85. So I was always there, but the venues were changed, you know.
Okay.
The Cameo, the good thing about the Cameo, I was there kind of from the beginning to the end, you know, because at the end of the Cameo, they were having bands like Pearl Jam and Fish and like bigger bands. I saw like Beastie Boys and the Rollins Band play there, you know, and that lasted in Slayer and Overkill and Motorhead, which was the loudest show I've ever been to, man. I was actually doing spotlights for that show because I had a buddy that was actually working at the Cameo, and he's like, hey, come down, I'll get you in free. And I remember the Slayer Motorhead Overkill show was just so fucking loud. It was great. Brutal too. It's brutal because you had your punks, your skinheads, and your metalheads, and it was just like a melee the whole show. So Washington Square was kind of like the newer club. We had 1235, which Prince kind of owned. It was called Glam Slam at the time. It was 1235 Washington Avenue. But yeah, as far as RadioBaghdad, and then we also had Churchill's. We started playing Churchill's in like the early 90s.
probably like 89, 90 is when we first started going down there. So it seems like, and then Broward, we had Squeeze. Squeeze was always a good place for us to play. Plus five lounge out in Davie. So there's a few places we would hit.
Right. And as you're moving around to some of these different places, especially getting further south to the Miami area, were you connecting with other bands that perhaps you didn't really know as well, that you started to get to know better?
Yeah. So two of the bands, which were really our peers, I would have to say would be Load and Holy Terrors. We played a ton of shows with those guys. I remember first time seeing Load, I'm like, what the hell is this? These guys are fucking awesome. Great. Underrated, same with Holy Terrors. Holy Terrors to me, they were like almost like a Husker Du-ish kind of, I love Husker Du, it was just like, wow, these guys, great songs, So those two bands we kind of hooked up with a lot, and we started playing more shows with those guys. So I would have to say, out of the South Florida bands, it would be those two.
And RadioBaghdad put out a lot of music, as far as there's some tapes and there's CDs and some 7-inches and what have you. So what was that experience like for you, being able to go into the studio and record? And who were some of those people that you were working more closely with during those recording periods?
So my parents have a summer house in North Carolina, or they still have it. I was actually just out there a couple weeks ago visiting them. I took my dog with me for about a week. So they would leave me and my sister home alone for 6 weeks during the summer, So my brother would come over. We would set up in my dad's office and record like the early RadioBaghdad stuff. We call it 8107 Studios because I lived off 8107 was the house number. So those were the early recordings. Sounded okay. It was all like 4-track kind of stuff, You do what you do, cutting our teeth. I think our first time we went in the studio there was this dude in Deerfield. I think his name was Bob. He had this studio called L7 Studios. I think it was called L7. I forgot the name. Yeah, I forgot the name of the band he was in, but he was kind of more like a post-punk. It really wasn't like a heavy kind of band, but so we went in there and did a recording, the job recording. And on that record, we had a song called Stanley Bing, which they would actually play a lot in WKPX. So we would get airplay. WKPX actually, we were in tight with them, so they would play a lot of our stuff all the time. So it was kind of cool to be young and like hear it on the radio. Oh, that's my song,
Right. Quick sidebar on WKPX for those that aren't familiar. This was out of a high school, Piper High School. How important do you think that station was, and some of the DJs who would play a lot of the local bands of the time?
That station was a huge supporter of local music. It was great, because you would have back then, again, you would have Load, the Holy Terrors, you'd have the Living Kittens, you'd have Six Silver Spiders, you'd have this band called Love Canal, you'd have so many, and they would play this in rotation a lot, which was great. It was important. I was never a VUM guy because I don't think I really got that down or up in Broward, I should say. But I think VUM was probably similar. They would probably support a lot of the local bands and stuff like that. Now, I remember Glenn Richards had a show on, what was it, Zeta? I forgot what show that was, 96 or 98, whatever it was, And occasionally we would play, it was like maybe Sunday nights, it would only like an hour or two, they would give it to local music. So that was kind of cool too. So we were able to get played on that. And I think it was at that point, it came to a point where Pete Gross actually moved back. He went to Florida State. He moved back. He started a band with Brian Tatunic, which is the dude I started jamming with early. He was my neighbor guy, right? And they started a band called Collapsing Lungs. And this must have been, I don't know, 90, 91-ish, They were looking for a new drummer because their drummer at the time, he only had like a couple sample pads, like a kick and a snare. You just do, but they wanted an acoustic drummer, And they approached me and they're like, and they were more industrial kind of style, and they're like, hey, we're looking for a drummer. We do have some label interests. And, I was just like, I don't know, man. They took me to Farrow's Pizza in Tamarac. That was our local pizzeria since I was a little kid, and they're like, we have some label interests. Are you interested? I'm like, yeah, And finally, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I'm in, because I've grown up with Brian and Pete, and I want to play music. I want to do this, right? But then the caveat came. They're just like, well, you can't really play in another band because we're going to be doing this like a lot, So that was basically me giving the ultimatum, like, well, shit, I can't play with Radio Baghdad anymore, and that was my baby. So I thought about it. I talked to the guys in Baghdad, and it was kind of like breaking up with a girlfriend. When you leave a band, and this will come again in my life, is when I have to leave bands, and it's just like, it was a tough decision, but they kind of supported it. I don't know if they were pissed at me or whatever, but they had a backup drummer. They had somebody already kind of in line. So like, you know what, do it, So that's when I kind of got into Collapsing Lungs, and this was probably 92-ish. I don't remember the years, and we practiced a lot, man. We would practice like 5 nights a week for like 3-4 hours a night, So yeah, having my day job and doing that, it's like I really wouldn't have time for another band,
Where were you guys rehearsing?
So my brother-in-law, he was an orthopedic surgeon. He had this property of Dixie and Sample. It was a big strip building, and he had his practice on one end of it. And he's like, I don't know how he offered, he's like, hey, if your band wants to jam here, so Baghdad started there, and then Collapsing Lungs kind of moved in after that. And it was kind of fucked up because when Collapsing Lungs moved in, they kind of boarded off because it was an old dental clinic, right? So it had these old dental chairs in there, and it was like room to room to room to room, a couple of bathrooms. But Collapsing Lungs like boarded off the walls, that was kind of another barrier. Like, well, these guys aren't going to fucking come steal shit from us, So I don't know. So yeah, we jammed in Pompano. Really did a lot of hard work and writing a lot of songs, and there were label interests. We got to a point where it was like the last 2 labels that that we decided we were thinking about was Roadrunner. Like, we had Monty Connor from Roadrunner come down, see us at the +5. We had Jason Flom, which is a huge record exec now at Atlantic Records, come down. So we ended up going with Atlantic, so that was our like heyday into the major label industry kind of thing.
What was that whole experience like for you personally?
It was exciting, but it was also learning the bullshit of the industry, like how they don't really, they care about money. You know what I'm saying? It's like they care about numbers. They care about, so we went up to sign our contract to New York City. We stayed at the Chelsea Hotel, which is kind of cool because, the whole Sid Vicious thing and just all the past of the Chelsea and, all the stories of that. Signed our contract, went back to Florida, got a budget to do I think we did the demo at Spectrum Studios, which is off like, I think McNabb Road and Powerline or something like that. Sent it to Atlantic. They liked it, so they flew us up to New York to do an EP. And we tracked it was this dude, Jay Weiss. He was like a real estate mogul up in New York City. He was actually married to Kathleen Turner. I don't know if you remember. She was like a big actress, 70s and 80s.
Sure.
That was her husband. And there were like Murphy's Law recorded. There were a lot of bands actually tracked there. So it was kind of cool. Okay, cool. We're in a legit studio. Tracked the record there. We stayed at one of Jay's apartments, the owner's apartments. And when we got there, the painters just had finished painting. And back then they were using like oil-based paint. So it just stunk for like the 10 days we were there. We were probably high the whole time, on oil-based paint, right? So tracked the record. We had a show. We played a show at the Limelight. We opened up for Propane, this band Propane. And the Limelight was a crazy place in New York City in the 90s. It was an old church, and there was like a bunch of different clubs in this one church, right? It's like mayhem, like no rules, whatever you wanted to do. So we did that show. We ended up mixing it at Chung King, which is another huge famous studio. Like you had Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, Run DMC, Slayer, just like even up until like the late 90s. I think even sure. Amy Winehouse did a record there. And it was funny because we were tracking our stuff. LL Cool J walks in our room. I think we were in Studio B. And our sample guy, the guy who programmed the drum samples, he's like, yeah, I make all the stuff on my own. LL Cool J walks in. He's like,
here's the beat. And he's like, yeah, that's blah, blah, blah. And we all looked at our guy and we're like, you motherfucker, you know, you didn't program this, you stole it, you know, but hey, that's what samples were, right? Everybody was sampling stuff.
Right.
So yeah, went back to Florida, finished the record, went back to Florida. We shot a video for Crackerjack. You know, we played at the Edge, which now is Revolution. Or from the Edge, the Chili Pepper to Revolution. And we had Bill Ward, not to be confused with Black Sabbath Bill Ward, but Bill Ward was a videographer guy. He did a lot of like big videos in the 90s. He came down, we shot a video for that. Yeah, they gave us a budget to do a tour. You know, so then we had like a 4 or 5 week tour booked, and we got on the road, did that.
Where did the video get played?
I think we actually got on MTV. Like back then, it was like 120 minutes. You know, I think they played us in there once or twice. I don't think it was on heavy rotation, but you know, I think the label Atlantic was kind of just dipping their feet. Well, let's put this out there. And you know, back then the MTV was run by the labels. I mean, you had the labels were the influencers. You know, they would tell MTV what to play. So we did the tour, and there was some internal conflict with the band, and it got pretty crazy. So me and Pete Gross, the guitar player, we actually left. We had our buddy Chip, who we've known since the early mid 80s. You know, he was our roadie, and he was treated like shit. You know, he was talked down to and by management, and just so we're just like, fuck this. We're like a couple punk dudes, just like what. Everybody's equal, you know, in our end, right? So it's just like, don't talk down to somebody. It's just like, to me, the roadie's just as equal as the player. You know, it's just like, we're a family, right? So blah, blah, blah. We ended up leaving. This happened in Columbia, South Carolina, you know, and like I said, it was a pretty nasty scene. Pete Gross got a little crazy with a baseball bat in the RV, and so we rented a car, and on our way home, I remember calling on the way back to Florida. I called the Baghdad guys. I forgot who. It might have been Lester or something. I'm like, hey, I just quit Collapsing Lungs. I want my job back in Radio Baghdad, you know. And he's like, no problem, you know. So we got back to Florida. I got back in Radio Baghdad, and then we grabbed Pete Gross into Radio Baghdad, you know. So now it was a solid 5-piece.
Was that the end of Collapsing Lungs at that point, or did the band go on?
They kind of went on. They got, they got George from M. Bougalard to play for a little bit. And then they got our on the beginning of the Collapsing Lungs tour, and I think our third or fourth show was actually in Columbia, South Carolina, too, where actually the tour ended, strangely. We played with Murphy's Law, and back then, Mike McDermott he was playing with Murphy's Law, and now, now he's with Joan Jett. He plays, he's a killer guy, dude. So he ended up being friends with our manager. So I guess after George Kokoris came, played with them, they brought Mike McDermott down, and then they kind of changed the names to Lungs. Like Brian left the band, and then Frank was the lead singer, and then they went to Lungs at that point.
You then rejoined Radio Baghdad, and was it any different coming back to the band at that point, or was it just like picking up where you left off?
Picking up where I left off, because I've known these guys forever, and I played with them for years prior. It was a little awkward because I kind of felt guilty leaving in the first place. You know what I mean? But I think it was in a career thing. It was like, well, hey, this is what I want to do. So I'm just going to explore my options at least, So, but yeah, we kind of picked up where we left off, added Pete as a second guitar player, and started, tracked another cassette. And then in the back of Maximum Rock and Roll, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's a magazine, kind of like Flipside, the last like maybe 5 pages were like classifieds. So there was a German record label looking for American bands to bring over. So we're like, okay, cool. Let's send them a tape, see what they think, and they loved it. And we went in and tracked with. Keep in mind, like the past few recordings were all with Jeremy Staska. He was like the godfather down there of the recording studios, like in the punk scene and metal scene.
How'd you like working with him?
Loved it. He was like. He was like one of the family members, it was just super easy to work with, chill guy, So we tracked our record, and then Friendly Cow was a record label in Germany. So they put it out, they brought us over in 96, and we did like a 5-week tour over there. And that's really when we got to see the dirtier, seedy sides of like,
Yeah, because touring the U.S. back then in the '90s and touring in Europe was completely different. In Europe, it's great because a lot of the venues you play, you stay at, right? Like maybe upstairs or downstairs, there's bunk beds. They cook for you. They make you. You get there, you have dinner. After show, they'll make you food. In the morning before you leave, they make you food. There's breakfast. So, and then the beer is unlimited, just flows. Playing a lot of squad houses. So that was our introduction to playing like the squad house scene, and it was a lot more PC over there. I remember one of us would be, "What's up, motherfuckers?" And people would be like, "Why don't you say fatherfuckers?" And we're just like, "Huh, it's what we say in the U.S. We don't mean anything by it." So it was kind of a different world, but it was great.
Did you feel like you guys were received well over there?
Yeah, we were. Because back then, I mean, maybe still now, the kids like Doug, they just ate up the American bands. They loved it, And like, keep in mind, we would have like a 2-hour set. So we would play our set, and then we'd know a shit ton of covers, right? And the kids would just love the covers, and it was just like throwing beer everywhere, and just it was great, Unfortunately, Lester, probably after the second or third week, I think he caught the flu, but we had over there you have like house call doctors, so they came to the hostel or the squad house, and they told him he had a parasite, so which technically is the flu, but he heard the word parasite and he thought he had like bugs in his body, like, oh, I got bugs in my body from Europe. So that freaked him out. So he actually flew home, and we finished the tour without him because we could do it,
Who picked up
between
vocals?
me, Hawkins, and Gordon. We all did. Keep in mind, we all wrote the songs.
Sure.
And a lot of us wrote the lyrics too. So we all knew how the lyrics went and how they should go. And we were just like, hey, why not?
After that tour and you came back to the U.S., did you all take a break, or did you just keep going and start playing more shows down in South Florida?
Yeah, we kept playing shows. I mean, so after that tour, I get back, and probably a week or two later, the singer, our buddy Jason Morgan, he was actually a DJ at WKPX. He had a band with Chris Hawkins called Hudson. It was another side band that Hawkins had. So we got back from that '96 tour, and he's like, "Hey man," he's like, "my buddy's band, they have a tour book, but their drummer can't do it." I'm like, "Well, when is it?" And he's like, "Oh, it's next month." I'm like, "All right, who's the band?" He's like, "It's Against All Authority." So I'm like, "All right." I knew Tim Far Out, who had Far Out Records. I've known him since I was like 15, so I knew he was in the band. So I'm like, okay, I kind of know somebody in the band. So I'm like, okay, cool. I got their record. I think they had just put out "Destroy What Destroys You." learned all the songs. Drove down. Jason Morgan would take me from Tamarac. I think at that point, my parents, in '95, my parents actually built a house in Lauderhill. So I was kind of a little closer to Jason Morgan at that point because he kind of lived by Piper. So we'd go all the way down to Gould's, which is like an hour south, That's where Danny lived. And Danny had his this shed. They call it the Butt Hut because the Crumbs and AAA would practice there. And this little like 12 by 12 shed we'd play in. And I went down there and I learned pretty much that record and probably like, some 7 inches or whatever that they had. And then before you know it, I was on the road with those guys for another 4 or 5 weeks doing that tour in '96.
What are some good stories you have from that tour?
Those guys, I mean, I really connected with those guys on because it was like with Baghdad, I love the Baghdad guys, but there was always some type of internal turmoil, like somebody fighting or, they were just like, it was weird, But with AAA, it really wasn't like that. It was like, oh, this is actually relaxing, And I'm not saying anything bad with the whole RadioBaghdad thing because it was great, It was just more mellow, I think, with AAA. And I got to get out to the West Coast, which I've never been to the West Coast before with those guys. So playing Gilman and just like, that was my introduction.
I mean, that had to be cool considering just the history of that place.
Yeah. No, it was cool. And '96, Gilman was still, I mean, I think to this day they're still open and doing shows, but New Orleans, I think our van actually got broken into in New Orleans. We came out the next day. The window was smashed, and I think our trombone or horn, one of our horn players' thing was ripped off, and some of our luggage, and so we just duct taped the window and just kept going.
Was it common to run into situations like that on these tours and playing in different
Yeah,
towns?
yeah. I mean, like any bigger city or even smaller places. I mean, you're gonna even today. I mean, I see stories on like Facebook, like a band's trailer will get ripped off, and these days it's a lot easier because you have social media, so people can post it and people know instantly, right? Like, oh, be on the lookout for this trailer or these guitars, or So a lot of the times it's hopefully recouped a lot faster, But back in the '90s, we didn't have phones. We'd have to stop and get an atlas from a gas station and just like
Right.
map it out. Like here's where we have to go. We'd have to stop and pull over to advance the shows on a payphone. That's how
Sure.
it was.
Was
And
there
I think in the early days prior to us, like back in like because I think Black Flag kind of paved the roads for a lot of us, touring, because they were just like crazy. They're in town. Greg Ginn's version of Black Flag's in town here in Fort Wayne tonight. But they paved the road for a lot of us, and with networking and creating scenes, right? And just like yeah, so. But yeah, back in the day, it was a lot harder than it is now.
Of course. Yeah, no doubt about it. And thinking about recording with Against All Authority AAA, what are your memories of recording with them, and what are some of the songs that really stand out to you personally?
So yeah, so I did the '96 tour with them, and their drummer couldn't do it just for that tour. So Chris came back, and and then I think in '97, late '97, he kind of was told the guys he's leaving the band. So that's when they approached me. They're like, hey, you're super cool to chill with, and I'm like, okay, cool. So then I was juggling Radio Baghdad and Against All Authority. My first recording with Against All Authority would have been 24-hour Roadside Resistance. And we went down to the dungeon, Jeremy Dubois, he did a lot. He did an Irish Car Bomb record, which we can get to later, and a lot of other local bands. He did actually when I was in Hudson too. I actually joined Hudson prior. This is probably '97, '98. I was also in Hudson too. So I think I was in 3 bands. Almost had Against All Authority, Radio Baghdad, and Hudson I was doing. So yeah, we tracked that record down there and got put out in Hopeless. And like I said, it was like a thing where I seemed like I was always on the road with one of those 2 bands, Baghdad or Against All Authority,
I do want to backtrack just a little bit to go back to Hudson because there was the CD Lane Meyer Was Right. And as far as Hudson goes, any memorable shows stand out to you that you would just
Yeah. Yeah, so I again I can't remember how I got in the band. I think John was a drummer, and John took my position in Radio Baghdad when I was with Clap Sing-Alongs. He had a brother Jimmy who played bass. He was a bass player in Hudson. So I think they moved. I think they moved to Texas, and Hawkins and Jason Morgan wanted to keep the band together. So that's when I stepped in, and Pete Gordon stepped in. So it's kind of, as you see, the formula's almost kind of, I don't want to say the word incestual, but it's like the same band members of Radio Baghdad were in a lot of bands together, right? So we went and recorded at Tapeworm. This was pre-Dungeon. It was a studio called Tapeworm, and Jeremy Dubois did that one. And we did Lane Meyer Was Right. And Jason Morgan, we had all the music down. Jason Morgan, I don't think had any of the lyrics. And as we were tracking, he was just like frantically scratching in a notebook, like writing all the lyrics down. And that record is great. I mean, you listen to that like back to back. I still listen to that record now. I'm just like, man, this is fantastic CD,
is a good one.
Yeah.
Hard to find a copy.
Is it? I don't know. I think I have one. My original one's still around. But yeah, so that's how I got into Hudson. And the funny thing is, it's like right after that happened, when I left AAA, Radio Baghdad kind of became defunct because Lester went to school up at Full Sail, right? So we were actually recording late 2000. We at Staska's, we were like his guinea pig for Pro Tools. He had just gotten Pro Tools. I think it was like late '99 or something like that. And we were doing a record there, and it really never got finished. I have the file somewhere where I can actually go back and probably remix it. It sounded weird because the way we tracked it, like I said, we were guinea pigs for Pro Tools, so it wasn't that great.
So Baghdad kind of, so now it was just like Lester went away to school, and then me, Hawkins, and Gordon. My wife's best friend, her husband was this dude Shannon. He was No Use for Names guitar tech forever. He was in with a Fat family on the West Coast, Fat Records, but he was living in Florida because his wife lived down here. They just had a kid, and so got introduced to him, and then we started a band called Irish Car Bomb. It was basically Radio Baghdad with Shannon added. And the cool thing about that band is me and Hawkins flip-flopped on drums and guitar. Like half the set I would play drums, half the set he would play drums, and I would play guitar, right? So we'd swap it out. And that's where I met Tommy Berman from Purple Skunk. We demoed at my house because I had a little recording studio at my house at that point, and he liked it. He's like, "Yeah, I'll put it out." So we recorded our first record, Tacos and Pornos, at the Dungeon, again with Jeremy Dubois. So he keeps coming in the picture, right? So he's a staple of South Florida as well.
Sure.
So yeah, so we did that, and shout out to Tommy, man, because that motherfucker like really supported us. We got our first tour, because Shannon worked for No Use, so he kind of finagled like, "Hey, can you guys bring my band on the road with you guys?" So we had a tour. It was like almost a 2-month tour. It was like, through the States, out to the West Coast, up to Vancouver, over to Montreal, down to Boston, and then over to Europe for another month, right? And I'm just like, I thought I gave up on touring, but Tommy supported. He was like, he paid for everything. He paid for the plane tickets. He paid for the rent a car. He paid for a lawn service to come over to my house and cut my grass when I was gone, right? So the dude's pretty hardcore, man. So love you, Tommy.
I remember too, Spikey, that when Pete Gordon was on, he mentioned something that at one point Fat Mike from Fat Records had shown some interest in Irish Car Bomb. What's your recollection of that?
So this is after our first record, Tacos and Pornos. Shannon, again, being part of the Fat camp over there. Fat Mike heard our first record and liked it. He's like, "I'll put you guys out," and we actually went out there. It was Shannon and myself and our buddy Devin. He was like our roadie guy. We went out for the 13th Fat Records 13th anniversary party. And it was at the Great American Music Hall in San Francisco, and it was like obviously No Effects, Lagwagon, No Use, Propaganda, and I think Tilt might have also played, right? So we got invited to that show. We went to Fat Records, the home base, and actually sat down with him. And he's like, "Yeah, I'm thinking." I forgot what month we went there. Maybe it was February-ish. I think it might have been the wintertime. But he's like, "Yeah, I'm thinking about maybe September putting something out by you guys." We're like, "Cool." So we're like, "Awesome, we're going to be on Fat Records." And that's like, when you're on Fat Records, it's like automatic fan base, and like, how it is. He even gave us there was a zine from Southern California, and they were interviewing him, and they're like, "Well, what are some of the bands you're going to put out?" And he listed Irish Car Bomb from Florida. He listed Against Me. Ultimately he went with Against Me. But we didn't know that. We got back. We recorded our second full length, called Ain't Quite Right, and there were some questions on why we didn't get signed to them. One was like, maybe Tommy, I think, was like, "Well, make it," because Tommy still owned the record, right? So he was like, "Well, make it Fat Records / Purple Skunk." I don't know if that was true. Maybe that's hearsay. Fat Mike actually told Pete Gordon, because Pete Gordon, after they played Revolution one time, Pete Gordon took him somewhere. He's like, "Yeah, to be honest with you," he's like, I just didn't like that second record. And so we don't know. So he ended up going with Against Me. And great. They're a great band.
Sure.
So Tommy put out the second record. That was under Purple Skunk again, Ain't Quite Right. And that's how that folded out.
As far as some other shows that Irish Car Bomb was playing, because again, this is pretty further ahead from some of the other bands we've been talking about in your journey, right? So perhaps there's some different venues that are around now and different people promoting shows and what have you. So what was that experience like in the climate in which Irish Car Bomb was playing?
Yeah, so back then we'd play. Back then we had the Tavern 213, downtown Fort Lauderdale, right around the corner from the Edge.
we'd play there a lot. We would play, what was the old Rosebuds church? I guess the Metal Factory. We played a couple shows there. And we would play Palm Beach. I don't even remember some of the venues, actually, to be honest with you. We were playing a lot, but the curse that Irish Car Bomb had, and the Radio Baghdad had the same curse, is that our music style was all over the place, right? I think if you were a musician, you got it, but if you were like just a music fan, you didn't get it. I mean, because we were doing anything from like more like poppier stuff, and this is pre-Green Day, right? Like poppier stuff like that, more Descendancy, right? To like heavy, fast stuff, and I don't think people wrap their heads around it. And Irish Car Bomb was almost an extension off Radio Baghdad. It was the same guys plus one, so the music style was somewhat similar, right? True. So a lot of bands loved it. We did that, like I said, we did a Frostbite tour with the Mad Caddies, Pulley, Irish Car Bomb, and I forgot, it was a Canadian band. But all the guys in the band's just like, damn, you guys are fucking badass. It's just like, thanks, but the people didn't really like it. It was weird.
You mentioned the Descendents more than once in our episode so far. Going back to Radio Baghdad, there's that connection where you all did some recording with Bill Stevenson. So what was that like?
Forgot about that. Yeah. So after our second recording with Friendly Cow, the German record label, Pete Gross hooked up with a dude from One Foot Records, right? And he really was into us. So he's like, yeah, I'll put on an album by you guys, So he fronted the bill. We went out to the Blast Room in Fort Collins. This must have been like 98, I think. 97, 98, right after Everything Sucks came out, right? So when Everything Sucks came out, I was like super into that record because I always loved the Descendents. I saw them on that tour at the Button South, and then all of a sudden it's like, damn, we're going out to record with these guys, right? So yeah, we spent 10 days out there. I remember the first time we walked into the studio, we still see Bill Stevenson. He's like, hey, you guys are Radio Baghdad? He just bends over and like rips a fart there. But that's like typical Bill. That's the Descendants, right? Ass Master General. So that was I forgot to bring that up, but that was that was Radio Baghdad's third full length on One Foot Records. So we got to track out there. We played a show out there with this band. Bug was Descendants roadie forever. He's actually on the Live Edge record. You can see him on the side. Rest his soul, but we played a show with his band, Bill the Welder. And then we also had Jason Livermore, which is like a gold record producer. He was actually engineering it too. But it was great having Bill in there and having, Stefan in there working on it, and Carl would come in, and it was great. So that was like a huge experience.
Why did Irish Car Bomb end?
So Irish Car Bomb ended like, Hawkins got a job, I think, up in Kentucky. At that point, he was working for Hustler Hollywood, and he got a job offer out of state. Shannon, our guitar player, also moved to Alabama at that point. And for the first time in my life, I'm like, fuck, I felt like a homeless guy. Like I was bandless. I didn't have a band, And keep in mind, I was recording bands all along. I started recording bands probably back in 2001. I had a studio. Tommy, again, shout out. I was able to get like this Sony DMXR 100 digital console from the Dungeon. He's like, they got an SSL. You want to, you want this? I'm like, sure. So I got that, a couple other pieces of gear. And so I started recording punk bands, down there. So I didn't have a band. And I'm just like, wow, since I was like 10, 11 years old, I always had people to jam with, So fast forward, I'm like, shit. So funny thing is, I recorded this band. I recorded the Shakers, because at that point, Joe Shaker lived on one side of me, Pat lived on the other side of me. So they had the Shakers and they had Malt Liquor Riot going on, right? So something happened, and they shared a guitar player. I mean, Pat played guitar, but they had another guitar player for Malt Liquor Riot, and Pat played bass in that band. So something happened where the guitar player he quit both bands at the same time, right? And I told Joe, I'm like, well, I know these songs. I'm like, I play guitar too. And he's like, yeah, let me ask Pat. And Pat was like,
Spikey can't play guitar like that, and I'm like, all right. So Joe and I got together a few times. I learned like 4 or 5 Malt Riot songs, right? Being neighbors, it was easy, because all you had to do was walk in my backyard and we jammed in my house in the old converted carport. So we learned a few songs. Pat came over. He's like, shit, all right. So then I was officially a member of Malt Riot, right? So, and then shortly after, a member of the Shakers. So they wanted to add a second guitar player again. And so now I was in that camp, right? All the while, still recording bands. And all the while, another band I need to mention was Middle Finger Mob, which I also recorded. That was actually my first band I actually recorded. Well, not really. I recorded Ego Trip long before that, but Middle Finger Mob was the first band I actually recorded on Pro Tools, and this was probably in 2000. And it was basically Fausto and Jeff from Load and Ray, and then this crazy singer, this dude Al. This is before they got Matt. So I did that record and then shifted. The singer left. They got Matt, singing, and Fausto left. And at that same point, when I was still kind of in the Shakers and Malt Riot, they asked me to join, so I joined Middle Finger Mob. So now I had 3 bands again going on at that point.
You went from that period of you didn't know what to do with yourself to now you got a lot. Business is picking back up again.
Well, yeah, but the period again, I think was very short. It was probably 4 or 5, 6 months max. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it wasn't that long until I picked up at it again. And I was also filling in for bands. Like I would fill in like Holy Terrors. Sam left from Holy Terrors to go with Interpol. So and they got Mikey, and then if Mike couldn't do it, and they also had Blake. It was like kind of Mike was more like the solid drummer, but I think he moved away. And they would have Blake do it, and then when Blake couldn't do it, I would do it. So I was just always playing, always having a full-time job, and having like little kids. I don't know how I juggle all that shit. But I just made it happen. Yeah.
You did. And I know you also did some fill-in stuff, or maybe it was even more than that, for Shai Hulud. How'd you get connected with those guys?
Okay, so now we got to backtrack back to like 98, 99, because I don't know how. I mean, they knew of me, but Steve had left Shai Hulud, and Matt Fox contacted me somehow. And at that point, I was still living with Pete Gross in Sunrise. We had a house in Sunrise. So I'm like, okay, I'm like, sure, I'll do it. So we did 4 songs, and we did a few cover songs. So we did Bad Brains, Fearless Vampire Killers. We did Bad Religion, Amnesia. We did No Effects, Linoleum, and I think an original, right? And a lot of these were on like 10 inches or splits. So Matt came over and learning the songs, and it was a lesson, man, because Shai Hulud wasn't like your standard like punk rock fast kind of just like beat. It was weird time signatures and weird just breaks and breakdowns, and so I'm like, okay, so it was a learning curve for sure, but I got it. We also go into Staska's and record. Now Matt Fox wants to change. Hey, instead of doing bum 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 bam bum bum bum, let's do it. I'm like, oh fuck, but we got it, and it was a pleasure to record with those guys. I was only in the studio with, I think it was Matt Fox, and the other guitar player was Matt. I didn't meet Chad at that point yet, so I just tracked my stuff and went up back to at that point, it was still Baghdad,
Was that it? Point. Was it just working with them in the studio? Did you play any shows with them?
No shows. It was just they just needed somebody to track shit real quick, and and at that point I was like the drum guy. Like if a band needed me, they call me, and I'm like, sure, I'll do it. I just love jamming. I didn't care about money or I just like playing music. So it was just that recording, those 4 or 5 songs, and never did a live show with those guys.
So with the band Malt Riot, they were a very hardcore band. It sounded, in my opinion, quite different than the Shakers. So a lot more hardcore sound. So what was that like? What was that like for you playing with a band like that? And also talk about some of the touring you all did, because you did go out to Europe, to Germany.
Yeah. So playing in a band like that was nothing new to me because, again, with Radio Baghdad, we had poppy song. The Shakers are kind of more like a face-to-facey sound of band. Malt Liquor Riot was more of a, I don't even know how you would describe it, just like a fast, furious kind of just like melee. But I was used to playing that. I was used to playing both because Radio Baghdad had songs like the Shakers, had songs like Malt Liquor Riot. So to me, I felt right at home in both bands, right? So we put out our own release. I recorded the Malt Liquor Riot record again. I think we just put it out by ourselves, and I used my connections from the Radio Baghdad days for Europe. I'm like, hey, sent these guys the songs. They were down with it. They booked the tour, and these tours were a little shorter. These tours are probably like 10, 12 days. Because now we all had jobs, so we could only take maybe like a week or so off. 10 days off. So we'd get there, fly into Germany. Germany was like our home base. We'd fly into Germany, practice the night before or the night we got there, and then bam, do like 8, 9 shows and then fly home. So with the Malt Liquor Riot, we did that. And then probably after the 5th or 6th show, our singer Adam, his wife was expecting at the time. I think she was due in a couple months after we were there. And he flipped out and we were in Munich, I think, and I wasn't Munich, Nuremberg. We were in Nuremberg, and he was kind of like, throwing weird vibes, like, "Hey, you guys feel like the same people are here every night watching us?" I'm like, "Huh? No." He grabbed his shit and he left. He left the venue that morning, And again, we would always sleep at the venue, right? So we're just like, nah, he'll be back. Where's he gonna go, right? Our next show was in Regensburg, I believe. So it was about the time to leave. So we're driving around Nuremberg. Like, Nuremberg's not a small city, right? So we're driving, like, figure he's going to go to the train station, obviously. So we're like, where the fuck is he? We don't know. So I think Pat called his wife and said, hey, we don't know what to do. So what would we do? So we went to we drove around a little bit. We're like, we don't know what to do. So we just told her to call us if anything comes back. So he ended up taking a train. It was weird. So he ended up taking a train, I think more towards France, or I don't know. We played the show without him the next night in Regensburg, I believe. He actually ended up calling us and was like, "Oh, I made a mistake. I'll meet you guys back the next day." And we're like, "Okay, cool. That's odd, but whatever, And then he called again saying, "Nah, I'm going home," So no hard feelings. We finished the tour without him because I've done that before with the Baghdad, right? When Lester left, it's like, okay, we do what we got to do.
Right.
We're not going to go home. We got these shows booked. It's like that was like our vacation anyway. We're like, hey, we're in Germany. We're having fun. Fuck it. So we finished the tour without him. And then kind of that band kind of fizzled out after we got back from that. And then it was more Shakers. Shakers went over to Germany, again, using the connections that I had with Baghdad. We actually had a pseudo version of Irish Car Bomb and Radio Baghdad. Like, we got John Owens to sing on one of the Germany tours. He sang for Vacant Andes and Band Number 12. And anyway, I got Joe Jit to play drums on that, and I would play guitar. So we did that a couple times. And then as I was doing the Shaker stuff, we would always book the night before Thanksgiving, usually either at the Poorhouse or the Fox and Hound Lounge in Fort Lauderdale. So we did that night, and a dude walks up to me with a CD. He's like, "Hey, my name's Scott." He's like, "Here's a CD of my stuff." He's like, "I really love your guitar." At that point, I was on guitar. He's like, "Maybe we can get together." He's like, "I know a drummer." And I'm like, "Okay." And I will get a lot of CDs back in the day, So a couple of days later, I put it on. I'm like, "Damn, shit's really good." Almost like a Hot Water Music-y meets Leatherface, kind of like just really good, well-written songs, right? So, yeah, he lived in Boca. So at that point, I was living in Deerfield, in my latter years in South Florida. And so he came over and we started a band called New Guy, So now I was juggling the Shakers and New Guy. So that was, yeah. Again, the train keeps rolling, my friend. I'm always doing something.
Was New Guy the last new band in Florida and the final band that you were in?
Yeah. So Scott, it turns out it was kind of perfect timing. Things weren't going that well in South Florida for me. Like, financially, I wasn't really making that great of money, and I had 2 kids, and I was struggling, and getting payday advances. And anybody knows if you get payday advances at the check cashing store, it's like
shit, half your check's gone. You know, sure, here, hey, here's your $500, but guess what? A week later, when you get paid, $500. So it's a constant cycle, right? So yeah, so things weren't that great down there. And my buddy, who was actually the original drummer for New Guy, moved up to here to Indiana to work for Sweetwater Sound, an online pro audio retailer, you know. And he called me up. He's like, "Hey man, how are things going?" I'm like, you know, not that great. I'm like, I'm kind of getting sick of South Florida. It's expensive as hell to live down here, and you know, I don't want to be doing what I'm doing in my 50s and 60s, you know, job wise at that point. Everything worked out, you know. And again, telling the Shakers is like, so Scott from New Guy was moving anyway. He was moving up back to California. So, but I had to break up with the Shakers, or you know, or leave the Shakers, because they still to this day are a band.
Right.
So I had to tell them like, "Hey guys, I'm leaving town. I'm moving up to Indiana." And they're like, "Fucking Indiana? What the hell are you gonna do up there?" But so anyway, I got this job up here. You know, in 2014, I work at Sweetwater, and I make a great living talking about guitars, drums, recording, things I've been passionate about since I was 7, 8 years old. You know what I'm saying? Finally, I'm like, I told you, my buddy, the drummer for New Guy, was here. He had a guitar player friend that they kind of already were writing songs. So it was nice. I came up here, I had a built-in band, right? So I was automatically back in a band again, which is great. So we had a band called Fighting Words, by the way, you know, so that was, this goes into my Indiana music travel, you know, so had Fighting Words for a year or two. That broke up. Me and the bass player started another band called Spicoli Culkin, where I moved to guitar and he moved on drums. And it's out there on the intranets, you know, Spicoli Culkin. And then through them, I met this other band that I'm still jamming with, Tijuana Tsunamis. They were looking for a drummer. So it was cool to move up here to Indiana and already have a network of people to jam with and already have bands, you know. So yeah.
The people that you were connecting with up in Indiana, did any of them just by chance, were they at all familiar with your previous work without you even having to do any kind of sharing?
They were not RadioBaghdad so much, but Against All Authority. We were up here, I think on the '96 tour, we played Fort Wayne, and maybe I don't know. It's kind of all the blur, you know. But I know we played Fort Wayne, but a lot of people up here knew, oh, Against All Authority, that's badass, you know. So it was cool, you know. So I already had some clout when I kind of moved up here, so it was kind of cool.
That is
but
cool.
I'm humble. I don't give a shit about that. It's just like I'm equal to you. I don't care, you know. Like we're all the same. So when I hear people like that, I'm just like, I like to fly under the radar and not.
But also with a band like AAA, and you think about the records that were getting put out, especially the albums, what have you, that was all put out by Hopeless Records. They had some pretty solid distribution, because you could find that their records almost anywhere. Did you feel like that was a win for you guys because of that relationship with Hopeless?
Absolutely. Yeah, we were label mates with like Sam Ian, our buddies like Falling Sickness. Digger was another band on that label, and I think the Queers were actually on that, or not the Queers. Fuck, I forgot who I'm talking about. But yeah, there's a lot of great bands on Hopeless. Have you seen them now? It's crazy. Like if you look at their roster now, they have wide gamut of different like rap and just like, you know, Sum 41 to like, I think Newfound Glory is actually on them too. I don't know if they still are now, but yeah, Hopeless Records became, you know, pretty big in the industry. But it was great to have that backing, you know.
No doubt.
Lewis was a great guy. He still is, you know. So, but yeah, so COVID hit 2020, and then my one band, Spicoli Culkin, which I played guitar and sang for, kind of split up because our guitar player was like, I don't want to be in the band anymore. And to be honest, I'm no front man. You know, in that band, I was playing guitar and singing, and I was kind of non-entertaining, I guess, because I couldn't really talk to the crowd. I'm more of like a recluse kind of, you know, just so we kind of split up, and I still had Tijuana Tsunamis, which we're still going. We just jammed yesterday. We're still going strong. And then probably 6 months after that, now keep in mind, Joe and I from AAA were trying to get, for the past like 10, 15 years, trying to get the AAA to do some shows again. Their last tour that they did was with, I think it was Less Than Jake, Real Big Fish, and Streetlight Manifesto. And they kind of got the diss on that tour where they'd have to play for like doors open at 7, you guys go on at 7, and so I think Danny just kind of was getting over it. He was like, fuck this, so I think he needed a break from doing it after all those years. So 2007 is when they stopped, So fast forward to 2000, probably late 2020, 2001. Prior to that, like promoters would call me like, what do we need to do to get you guys to play again? I'm like, without Danny, we can't do it. Sorry, there's nothing we can do. So I get the call from Danny. He's like, hey man, what would it take to start doing shows again? Just not touring, but like, doing one-off, doing fly dates. These days, there's a lot of festivals you can just fly to and do those, and he's like, how can we make that happen? Because, I'm in Indiana, Joe's in Miami, Danny's in Gainesville, right? And I'm like, well, funny you say that, because COVID, working in my industry, a lot of my customers were calling me up and they were ordering these little Scarlett audio interfaces, right? Little 2i2s. And they were telling me, they're like, hey, because they couldn't get together and jam either because everything was shut down. There was no way to get to a practice space or anything like that. So there was this app that my customers were telling me about. It was called Jam Kazam. Little did I know, 6-8 months later, I'd be downloading this app and giving it to the AAA guys. And that's how we started. We got on Jam Kazam, and it took about 4 or 5 times to do it. Because when you're not in the same room as somebody, it's odd, like not having eye contact but like anything else, you get used to it. So that's how we started. And we actually wrote a whole record. We got like 10 songs done, minus vocals and horns. We got to work on those. But we wrote a whole record doing it like that. I tracked the drums here. I would send it to them. Danny tracked the bass at Rogers from Les and Jake Studios in Gainesville. Joe did the guitars down in Miami. Technology, man, it's crazy these days. What you can do. Basically track and not be in the same room and rehearse and not be in the same. But the benefit was like, I'm like, look guys, by jamming this way, it's only going to make us tighter once we're all together in the same room. And it totally did. When we hit our first show back together was like in 2020, was it 21 or 22 at the Fest in Gainesville. And we were tight as fuck, dude. Like, I don't even think we practiced the night before. We just got so used to playing on Jam Kazam. We did it.
And because it had been a minute, what was the reaction like from what you can remember from those that were in attendance seeing the band at Fest?
A lot of excitement because a lot of people were like, AAA that was the band I was in that probably had the biggest following, right? And people loved it. People loved the logo. I know Danny was on here talking about how the logo was created when you had him on a couple months ago. People love the songs. People love the message. People love, we don't have any specific looks to us. We're just like shorts and t-shirts and Vans or Converse or whatever it is. It's just like I've never been in the bands that were like into dress up kind of thing, but people really were into us getting back together. And it was great seeing it, especially nowadays, now that there's social media, because back then, their farewell tour that they played, there was no social media. I don't think back in 2007, maybe, I don't know. Maybe MySpace or something.
MySpace. Sure.
I think that's all we had, but it wasn't like it is today, where people can just post comments after comments. And
right.
So seeing that was great, and it basically just evolved where we try to do like 8 to 12 shows a year. We just fly around to different festivals. We've been down to Mexico, up to Canada.
I think there was also the show that you all did at Revolution in Fort Lauderdale, where the same night there was a RadioBaghdad reunion. So how did that come about? And
oh my God.
What was that like for you doing that marathon?
So every time I get down there, I always get asked about doing a Baghdad, or, last time in September, we did an Irish Car Bomb and a Baghdad thing too, but I'll get to that. So yeah, the first time was the 25th anniversary of All Fall Down, right? So we brought the Suicide Machines down, played Revolution, killer show, organized a show at the Poorhouse for the RadioBaghdad reunion. And I almost died, man, because I think this was in July, and the AC at Revolution was broken, so it was hot as fuck in that place, playing for like an hour and something, and then literally wheeling my shit over to the Poorhouse, and the Poorhouse was just packed. It was I couldn't even get my stuff in there, right? The Shakers were playing at the time. I think they played first. And then
got my stuff on stage, because Poorhouse doesn't really have a stage, like a little 1 foot kind of riser. And then we just busted out an hour and a half Radio Baghdad set. It was great, man. It was like people were going ape shit, and I got over the whole humidity thing. Luckily I was handed a big bottle of Gatorade, and that saved my ass. Otherwise I would have just been passed out.
Is the style of playing any different for you going from a AAA gig to Radio Baghdad?
It isn't. AAA has a couple more ska parts in there, but we also have fast parts. But with Radio Baghdad, it's more just like furious. And there's furious parts in AAA too, but Baghdad's like balls to the wall, like the whole, the breakdowns are like not like your softer like ska breakdowns. They're just like more like a mosh breakdowns. So it's definitely more aggressive with Baghdad. So, but yeah, that was a blast. And that was the first time I was actually down there. And the funny thing about that show, again, I believe that wasn't. No, I was thinking about, I came down there once and we did a Malt Liquor Riot reunion, and that was right before COVID. It was Friday the 13th, 2020. I think I just flew down to see my family, and we did a Malt Liquor Riot reunion, and it was weird because COVID just kind of hit, but there was no regulations and shutdowns yet. And even the Poorhouse was kind of dead that night. It was like, it was weird. I remember flying back to Chicago. That must have been the 15th of March, 2020, and it was empty. And if you've ever been to Chicago's airport, it's a madhouse, right? So, and right after I got back, it was like everything was shut down. So yeah, that was a couple years prior to the Baghdad reunion. But yeah.
And the experience with Radio Baghdad and Irish Car Bomb playing the same gig, what was that experience like?
So yeah, that happened in September of, not this past one, but last September, 2024. Against All Authority, we were supposed to play with the Interrupters actually at Janice Landing in St. Pete. So we organized, hey, let's do a Baghdad / Irish Car Bomb set. I can't, forgive me, I forgot the name of this place. It's off Dixie Highway in Pompano. They had recently just shut down. But I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do it. At this point, Pete Gross lives in North Carolina, right? So I get down there. This hurricane, I forgot the name of the hurricane, was coming. Basically shut the Interrupter show down. Pete Gross couldn't drive down because he's like, dude, I'm North Carolina. I can't drive down there. And, so we did the show anyway, minus Pete Gross. But that was fun. It was basically me, Hawkins, and Gordon. And then we added Lester for Baghdad. And then we all sang for the Irish Car Bomb stuff. So that was great. Got to see Tommy. Tommy Berman came out of that show. Filmed it, I think, on Instagram, It was a good time.
Yeah.
So, and playing those songs, it's like riding a bike. It's like, we don't even need to rehearse them. I think it's just like, they're just in the back of your head, and you just get up there and play them. It's kind of cool to be on the same page as guys like that. Like, we don't need to rehearse. We've done these songs for 30-something years, right?
Sure. And when you look back, though, because you're playing some of these shows, these reunions, and a lot of the music may have been and was created years, sometimes even decades in the past. What is it like for you personally to just revisit some of these songs? Is it just like getting on the bike and riding it again, or does it feel any different for you in terms of the lyrics and the message and all that?
No, it's like getting on the bike and riding it again. The only thing I can say that's different, it's a funny thing that you mentioned this, because of Shannon from Irish Car Bomb. He's been asking me for a couple of years. He's like, dude, where the last recording that we did that we never did anything with? He's like, you got to find that, man. And Shannon, he's been with it, like right now he tours with Rise Against, right? That's his band he travels with. And he's like, send me. I'm like, dude, I'm trying. I'm digging around. I don't have them on my hard drives anymore to remix them, which kind of sucks. Because back then all the hard drives were like SCSI drives, and it's like they would crash, and now everything's like Thunderbolt. And I had a couple SCSI drives that I actually kind of tried to recover, but the files weren't on there. So he finally found a CD that I sent him
literally like 2 weeks ago, I think, and he sent, I'm like, dude, send me these. He's like, I don't know how. So he actually got them digitized and he sent me these. And I think it was literally last weekend where I got these, and I'm listening to it. I'm like, fuck, great songs, man. Some of them were finished. Some of them weren't, some of them had lyrics to them. And I'm just like, damn, if we just would have stayed a band, it's like, so listening to those songs again kind of hit more hard because it was like, what could have been, right? If a band would have stayed together. And yeah, so, but for the most part, it's like riding a bike. You play them and they just live in your mind forever.
Have you guys considered at all doing anything with getting the music more out there for people to stream, like on a Bandcamp or on Spotify or anything like that?
Just this past week, we might have discussed. I sent the music to Hawkins and Gordon, and we're just like, man, how can we need to put a page together and get this out there? So it's like in the works, but with unfinished songs like that, it's kind of hard to be like, maybe we can take 2 or 3 or 4 and put them out there. We'll see. And
just the band's catalog as a whole, there really isn't a very large footprint at all online.
We have two records. Yeah, exactly. We had a MySpace page, but it's weird. If you so did New Guy. New Guy had a MySpace page too. But if you go to them, you can't. I guess somehow the music was taken down. I don't know. We didn't take anything off. I think it's just like the network. I don't know.
Yeah, I think all that stuff is.
It'd be nice to get out there on like SoundCloud or even Reverb Nation or something.
Yeah, just for people to be able to check it out, and because some of the CDs and what have you don't pop up too often, you don't really come across them a whole lot. So, and also many people don't even have a CD player. Many people don't even have a CD player anymore. So outside of the last time you went out with AAA, is there anything else coming up?
I guess I can mention it because it's been released. It's in April. We play the Not Your Corridon Fest. It's like right outside of Philly in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. And then we're going to try to book a show in Brooklyn, Boston, and then do the Pennsylvania show. And so that's in April. And then we have everything else coming up. I was kind of bummed to see, I don't know if you saw that, but the Punk Rock Bowling guys, Mark and Sean, posted they're not doing it this year, which is kind of crazy, because we played that a couple of years ago. Right. And it was great. So I'm kind of sad to see that's not happening.
Yeah.
Because we probably would have done that in May.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's been a year or two since we played that, so that would have been a great one to go to again.
And I know you mentioned this too, Spikey, that AAA has been that band that is just the most widely known and has so many dedicated fans of the band. Do you have you had any moments where people approach you and say, hey, I want you to sign my record, or hey, I want to grab a picture with you? Does that ever happen in your travels with AAA?
In my travels with AAA, yeah. We played Punk in the Park last September, and we had like a meet and greet actually, which is kind of weird again because I'm not used to normally doing those things. I feel kind of awkward. But yeah, there's a shit ton of people, autographs and pictures, and even when we do these other random shows, it's like we're always getting, let me get a selfie with you guys, let me get your autograph, but that's been happening since we started going to Europe back in the 90s, right? So I always felt weird about signing autographs, but I didn't want to be the dick that's going to be like, no, I'm not signing that. I don't want to be that guy, So like I said, I'm more humble, but it's like, okay, sure, here you go. So yeah, we get that. Even though the audience has gotten older,
sure,
maybe their kids now like it. We see a lot of parents bringing their kids to the shows too, wearing like AAA shirts. So that's always a blast seeing too.
Oh, no doubt about it. And as your kids, I'm not sure how old they are now, but what do they think of Dad's musical journey?
Yeah, they love it. My kids now. I have 2 daughters. They're 20 and 24. Last November, no, it was a couple Decembers ago, we did a run with Suicide Machines. We did Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago. And and I'm like 3 hours from, Fort Wayne's like 3 hours from anywhere in the Midwest, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Cincinnati, Indianapolis is a little closer, but you can hit all these. That's why it's cool living here because you can hit all these places in a couple hours.
So my daughter actually came out to the Detroit show at the St. Andrews Hall, and it was cool having her. That was the first show because she would see me with the Shakers, like she was growing up, and maybe Irish Car Bomb, but they weren't like big shows like this, you know. So now being in her, she was probably like 22 at that point, like seeing me play in front of like a couple thousand people like, going off is like, it's pretty cool.
And it's so wonderful to hear your story and to know that you have no end in sight, you know, still that AAA connection, also what you're doing in Indiana where you live now. So, and who knows, you might reconnect with some other guys and in
Yeah,
Florida and do something
it's
else.
always open. You know, we never know.
You never know. So, as we get ready to close things out, Spikey, I'd like to give you the last word. Any final thoughts you'd like to share to the folks out there, both checking out this episode on YouTube and also listening to it?
Final thoughts. I think I've spoken all my thoughts. Again, I'd like to shout you out by doing this because we need this in the community. I've watched a ton of your shows, you know. And again, I think I told you in the intro, I don't really do these this is my first podcast I've ever done. I don't, you know, I tend not to do stuff like this, but I think it's important that my story gets out there. And a lot of my peers have been on here, and a lot of my peers have been saying, oh, you need to get Goldbach on. And, you know, so I'm like, okay, let me do it. But I thank you for what you're doing. And anybody who's ever been a fan of any of my bands, thank you. I'm here. You can find me on Facebook. If you have any questions, you need to talk, silly comments, snide remarks, whatever.